Late afternoon light across ivy-streaked brick, the campus moving like a slow river of coats and umbrellas. A bell tolls, somewhere far off. There are places in the world that teach you to be small by accident. Lecture halls with too bright lights, critiques that slice like winter wind, the polite, careful politics of academic life. Maya had learned early how to fit her hunger for color into margins. Paint on scraps, sketches tucked into her notebooks, a quiet stubbornness that looked from the outside like restraint. On the day she met Elena differently, the air had the taste of rain and nervous possibility. Maya carried her portfolio like a secret weapon. Finals had thinned the campus to those who needed something and those who needed nothing. Elena Winters moved through the corridor with a measured grace, a woman who wore her competence like a well-cut coat. She taught modern aesthetics, a name that suggested distance, and that distance was part of her charm. Elena was 36, engaged, according to the hallway whispers, to a curator who spoke in polished syllables and kept his jackets in the boardroom where Elena's laughter used to be. She wore a ring that had never been in a photograph, and she had opinions about light that could make an argument feel like a caress. They first spoke because a portfolio had gone missing. Maya, who stayed late one evening to rework a watercolor, discovered her best set of studies had been taken from the drawing rack. She found instead a small folded note. "Meet me in 317. E." The door to Studio 317 smelled faintly of turpentine and lemon oil. Elena sat on a stool, sleeves rolled, a soft scowl that belonged to someone who had tasted frustration and decided to name it. When she looked up, something like surprise crossed her face. Surprise that the thief had followed a quiet summons. "Those are bad habits," she said, and the scold was half, something else. Maya swallowed. I needed a better critique. I thought..." She stopped because she had always stopped when she felt too bright. Elena's laugh was a small thing, private as breath. "Critique is never free." She tapped the edge of the portfolio. "But I prefer honesty to theft." She gestured. The chair beside her was not empty in the way a chair can be empty. It was empty in the way a pause can be full. They sat, and the conversation unwound like the slow unspooling of thread. Elena spoke of composition as if it were a language you could learn to translate your own feeling into. Maya spoke about paint, like confession. Between them, the light in the room softened. It knew them suddenly, and decided to keep its opinion to itself. By the time Maya left, the rain had thickened into a steady hush. Elena walked her to the steps and did something she rarely did in front of a student. She smiled, without reservation. "You have a way of seeing hurricanes and drawing them as windows," Elena said, and in that sentence she gave a courage Maya had been saving for emergencies. Maya almost walked back to campus the next week with nothing changed, but a smallness of heart. But she kept seeing Elena's sentences in the margins of her sketches, the way a person's name can become an ache and a map at once. They met more. Office hours that stretched into late-night conversations about paint and identity, Elena arguing for restraint with a fervor that felt almost like worship. Maya pushing back with the rawness of someone who had learned to be brave because bravery cost less than silence. Rumors always had short legs in a small arts building, but there are reasons people whisper, because quiet things grow where attention goes. Maya found herself wanting to be at Elena's critique nights, not to be seen, but to sit near a person whose voice rearranged the world into colors she could finally name. Elena, meanwhile, would stay after the last student left and offer a cup of tea. She began to tell stories, tiny, undramatic, about a life built on careful decisions, about long evenings in gallery offices, about a love that was almost right, namely Thomas, who had been attentive and rare, who loved schedules and frameworks, and had offered Elena stability, like a neat frame. Engagement announcements had been blandly celebratory. Elena had been on that list a month before Maya met her. And then something happened, slow as time itself. A tenderness unclenched. It began in small things. Elena lending Maya her coat during a sudden storm, the way she would rephrase Maya's sentences into sharper, kinder versions, not to correct, but to place them where they could breathe. The way her hand would find the rim of a teacup, the same way her eyes found the best angle on a painting. Between critique and kindness, a new grammar was being invented. "You should enter the juried show," she said one night, tapping a charcoal line. "You'll be ready." Maya wanted to say yes and mean it. She wanted to believe that following a professor's suggestion was mere practicality, not the heart-bending rearrangement that would follow. When her work was hung in the gallery, two small canvases, blue and a seam of gold, Elena stood by the wall and looked at it as if she had found a map she had once forgotten. There was a small, involuntary softness to her mouth that made the curator across the room frown and then step in politely with an explanation about lighting. Rumors arrived like pigeons, soft, insistent. Elena had been engaged. Elena was professional. Elena maintained boundaries. Yet boundaries are often porous, and sometimes they are chosen to protect things that are already brittle. Maya told herself she would not fall. She had fallen before, for the wrong person, in the wrong city, with all the messy consequences of loving someone who preferred the distance a schedule provided. Falling offered no guarantees, only the thrilling possibility of breaking into light. She kept her sketchbook close and her nights guarded. There is a particular kind of intimacy that arrives when someone remembers the exact shape of your disappointments and keeps them safe. Elena knew Maya's mother's voice, its tendency to quiet at the end. She knew the exact line Maya used to stop herself from telling the truth when it might hurt. Elena began to press small fingers of kindness into the places where Maya had been careful. She began to call. She began to show up. One evening, after a rehearsal for a lecture that stretched into the black hours, Maya walked Elena home beneath an uncertain sky. The city smelled of rainwash and the distant mechanical song of a tram. Elena was quiet, and there was something in the curve of her shoulders that suggested she carried more than lectures, a weight of a life that had been arranged to minimize surprises. They stood at Elena's building, hands tucked into each other's pockets because the night required it. A lamplight hollowed them. Elena looked like someone who had rehearsed being reasonable and then forgot her lines. "Maya," she said, voice low, "there's something you should know." My heart rearranged itself. "You mean about the show?" Elena shook her head. "No." She hesitated, the small fold of indecision someone practices in private. "I'm engaged." It was the kind of sentence that should have been simple and factual. Instead, it landed like weather. Maya's mouth went dry, or perhaps it simply recognized the obvious. Elena had always existed in the orbit of other people's plans. The ring, the dinners, the polite photos. It had always been there, a small, as of yet unacknowledged dagger. "So, why do you tell me now?" Maya asked, though she knew why the world sometimes demanded honesty when proximity made silence unfair. Elena's hand found Maya's in the dim. "Because I don't want you to make unanswered questions into stories. Because I don't want there to be secrets between us when you stand under bright lights and listen to people evaluate your courage." She drew in a breath. "And because when I look at you, I feel something I cannot name properly." Maya felt, in the low swell of the city, an answering note, something that was not merely admiration but an unspooling recognition. Here was a woman who saw her, and the seeing did not ask permission. They separated that night with a kind of careful silence that feels, in its own way, reverent. Some things do not require immediate action to be irrevocable. The small admission seated itself like a new memory. Both of them wore it like a luminous bruise. They tried for a time to hold themselves within existing shapes. Elena was engaged after all. There were dinners to attend and people to answer to. Maya kept to her student schedule, long hours in the studio, short nights. But the mind is a treacherous cartographer. It redraws coastlines without telling you. Late-night messages arrived, a photograph of a tea-stain sketch, a sentence of praise, a question about a stubborn mark. Each small message read like a permission, and each answer like consent. You do not fall in a single dramatic instant. Falling is patient. It is the way a door worn at the edge finally opens. It is the taste of sugar where there was only salt. One afternoon, Elena invited Maya to see a private collection at a small gallery downtown under the pretense of research. The gallery smelled like old paper and citrus. The curator, a man in a coat with elbow patches, did not linger. He had his own life to maintain. Elena and Maya walked the rooms alone, the city's muted light folding in like cloth. There was a painting, not spectacular by any public metric, but
Maya swallowed. And I am terrified of being the thing that breaks you. Elena's fingers brushed the back of Maya's hand, and the contact made a small sound inside both of them. Then we must be very brave, she answered. Not reckless. Brave in a way that honors what's been. They kissed then, not like a theft, but like a mutual agreement. The kiss was less violent than the decision. It was a conversation. It said, I have looked at your wounds. I will not weaponize them. It said, I will not pretend the rest of the world is not there. It said, I choose you and will try, imperfectly, to be careful. The aftermath was not tidy. Elena's engagement did not dissolve overnight. There were meetings and rehearsals and dinners where Elena performed an identity she had practiced. There were nights when Maya would lie awake and imagine futures that would be legally complicated and ethically fraught. There were mornings when Elena would come to the studio and sit with Maya while she worked in silence, offering coffee and the occasional stubborn, steady critique. Something miraculous and quietly inconvenient occurred. They began, slowly, to talk about what it meant to love someone when other people's lives were tethered to those choices. Elena spoke to Thomas with the honest, painful clarity of someone who had decided she needed to be wholly herself rather than convenient. There were arguments, plausibly boring, human ones, about obligations and promises that had been made to other people. There were tears that belonged to more than one person, and apologies that were not all meant for each other. It is easy to romanticize the breaking of engagements in art. It is less often acknowledged how many small, ordinary acts it takes to unravel something that once felt like certainty. A conversation late into the night with the person you are leaving, a hand steadying another's when the world tips. Elena tried, as best she could, to be honorable. She wrote long, careful letters. She met with Thomas in a neutral place with the intention to explain rather than injure. Thomas's pain was complex, and for a time it occupied rooms with its own gravity. There were bruises the world could see, family anger, the disappointment of friends, but there were also things that could not be measured in public, a slow unmaking of futures that had been built on someone else's timetable. Maya kept her head down in studios and cafes, painting like a person learning to draw water from a new well. There were moments when she wanted to run, to make a clean break, and leave Elena to the consequences she had chosen. There were nights when guilt found her and pressed cold fingers under her ribs. But Elena's small acts, bringing soup on nights when Maya forgot to eat, staying and reading until her hands grew heavy, created a framework for the kind of love that is not merely passion, but also care. They did not announce themselves with banners or furious public scenes. Their love was less an uprising and more a redirection of daily habits. Elena left the engagement with as much softness as possible. She did not make a spectacle. She chose to be honest in private, to tell Thomas that she had found a tender thing in a student's laugh, and that she could no longer pretend the shape of her life would fit the frame he offered. Thomas, with a dignity that surprised them both, accepted the truth and retreated to rebuild his own world. Not every story in the world resolves with clean lines. This one did not either. It resolved in human ways, with apologies, with patience, with the slow untying of naughty commitments. When the dust settled, months later, after legalities and logistics and a dozen quiet administrative meetings, Elena and Maya walked into a small apartment they would share. It was modest, with a window that drank in the morning and a single shelf that would, in time, hold both of their books. They painted a thin line of gold along the inner edge of the doorframe, the way two people might stitch their names into a seam. The gesture was symbolic and utterly ordinary, a marker of permanence that no one else had to approve. The campus, which had watched them like a patient audience, did not erupt in scandal. There were still critiques and emails and the occasional awkward suggestion from a colleague. But there was also a new cadence to Elena's lectures, an ease in her voice that was rare before. She had quietly traded convenience for truth. There were days of clumsy adjustment. Maya learned in 1,000 small exchanges how to ask for help and how to receive it. Elena learned how to be less of a fortress and more of a harbor without losing herself. They learned how to negotiate schedules and palettes, and nights where one of them would stay up to answer the fear of the other. There were arguments about frames and the proper way to hang a painting, apologies offered and accepted, like tiny rituals of repair. In the end, it was not a cinematic gesture that sealed their choice, but a breakfast where they both had paint on their fingers and laughed when a cup toppled, and a small, quiet admission across the smoke of 2 mugs. "Thank you for being brave," Maya said one morning, mid-sip, as the city awoke outside. Elena reached across the table and brushed a smear of ultramarine from Maya's cheek, her touch patient and worshipful. She replied, "Thank you for staying." They kissed in the morning light not because the world demanded it, but because they had built a shelter with 2 hands. It took honesty, abdication of convenience, and the kind of bravery that chooses imperfect, hardworking love over the allure of what is easy. Fade out. Soft piano, the hum of an ordinary city that had, in the end, made room for the 2 of them.